started. In case you hadn't noticed it, on your handouts each week, I'm highlighting in red kind of where we are in the history, and we're still in the divided kingdom, and today we're going to move into the southern kingdom, because you may recall that last week, thus ended
The northern kingdom.
the northern kingdom. However, before we journey south, I want to take a moment to talk about two words that were important to many of the prophets of the Old Testament, but in particular our friend Hosea from last week. The first word that I want to talk about, where did I move? Is the Hebrew word hesed. Okay. That's a dead duck. Which can either be CH or just HESED, which is generally translated as loving kindness. The prophets talk about Hesed a great deal. Hesed can also be translated as steadfast love. It deals with a responsibility towards another in an established relationship. It has to do with providing that which is essential for that relationship. That can include deliverance in disasters. Under the Old Testament covenant, all of the Israelites were called to share Hesed with each other. That is because that is what God shared with each of them. In the story of Hosea and Gomer that we talked about last week, Gomer broke Hesed with Hosea. She broke that loving kindness, that steadfast relationship. And in his book, Hosea talks about how Israel has broken Hesed with Yahweh. Such a break should lead to divorce. And as we said last week, Hosea did not divorce Gomer. Instead, he tried to bring Gomer back into that relationship of loving kindness. Beyond Hesed is another form of a loving relationship, which, that's a B, in Hebrew is adaba. Adaba is self-sacrificing love. And in the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament, the word, adaba is not it. It's ahava. Adaba was something the General Convention came up with a few years ago. We won't go down that road. Fitchburg. Yeah. Ahava is self-sacrificing love. And in the Greek Old Testament, called the Septuagint, it is translated agape. Self-sacrificing love demands no response. It is not erased by what the other party does. It goes beyond a covenantal relationship. In fact, ahava exists where there is no covenant. For Hosea, Israel was guilty of breaking the covenant. Yeah.
There's just, with agape, there's sometimes the idea that it's not transitive, that it doesn't have an object, that it's a state as opposed to the love which has an object. object, is that?
The love which has an object in Greek is generally translated eros
Right.
or philia.
Right,
But agape is not my love for Ben, wherever he is.
right.
Okay?
That's the point.
It is a much wider thing than just one-on-one.
Cross.
Well,
For you only, Dixie.
Thank you.
Hosea, in his book, said that the sin of Gomer, the sin of Israel, was the lack of the knowledge of God. Israel, meaning the northern kingdom, knows and loves Baal. And they have turned away from the covenant faith. And he judged them in his book with some ugly, terrible language. But God's steadfast love and his self-sacrificing love from the beginning could not be destroyed by the sins of Israel. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, it's going to be a few weeks before we're going to come back to this, but agape is going to, and self-sacrificing love is going to come up when we start talking about the Messiah and who the Messiah is and how the Messiah interacts with the people of the first century AD. But it's there already. Okay, so now we're going south. They didn't have a Mason-Dixon line in those days, but we're going south of the old-fashioned Mason-Dixon line into the kingdom of Judah. We are still in the 8th century. The kingdom of Israel is gone. The kingdom of Judah is still hanging on. There are 2 8th century prophets in the southern kingdom of Judah, both of whom are probably fairly well known to us. One is Isaiah, and the other one is Micah. We're going to spend a fair amount of today looking at Isaiah. We probably won't get to Micah until next week. Both of these are writing prophets. You remember a few weeks ago we talked about the writing and the non-writing prophets. We've moved past the non-writing into the prophets going forward who have left us their own oracles, their own words. And of course, Isaiah is one of them. Isaiah tells us about his call, his election. Okay? And he tells us about that in the 6th chapter of the book of Isaiah. It is not a casual reference, his call, because he begins the description of his call by telling us exactly when it happened. In the year that King Uzziah died.
So he's dateable.
He is very dateable. Not what I was saying last week about sort of from here to sort of from there. The beginning of Isaiah's election, his call, is the death of King Uzziah, and that Uzziah died in 742. How do we know this? Not just from Jewish history, but from history of the region. 742 was when Tiglath-Pileser was pushing into the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom would have 20 more years at the time that Uzziah died.
Tiglath was who then?
He was an Assyrian. He was the Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III, a rampaging king. Uzziah had been king of the southern kingdom for 40 years. His reign began in 782, 783, and he would die in 742. His reign in the south would parallel Jeroboam II in the north. And Jeroboam II in the north did a lot of things to try to build up the north to protect them from the Assyrians. In the south, Uzziah modernized the army, He gained control of major commercial routes that would go around and through the southern kingdom. He opened up trade with Arabia. Now bear in mind, at this point in time, Arabia is someplace east of the southern kingdom. Okay, southeast of the southern kingdom. Don't necessarily pin it down to where Saudi Arabia is today, but that's generally where we're talking. However, for all the good that Uzziah did, Uzziah developed leprosy. And to the Israelites, leprosy was a sign that you had sinned. So the great King Uzziah of the south develops a disease that says to everybody, despite all the good that you've done, something's wrong. Has to be something wrong. It meant that for the last 8 years of his reign, from 750 to 742, he had a regent who was his son, whose name was Jotham. So, 742, Uzziah dies. And what happens is that Isaiah, who's been hanging around the court, his faith in this earthly king, whom he supported, is removed by death. And in that moment, Uzziah saw the real king, who was Yahweh on his throne. Isaiah wrote in chapter 6, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. He was sitting on a lofty throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Attending him were mighty seraphim, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their face, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And they were calling out to each other, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is filled with his glory.' Their voices shook the temple to its foundation, and the entire building was filled with smoke. Then I said, 'It is all over. I am doomed, for I am a sinful man. I have filthy lips, and I live among a people with filthy lips. Yet I have seen the King, the Lord of heaven's armies.' Then one seraphim flew to me with burning coal he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched my lips, and with it said, 'See, this coal has touched your lips. Now your guilt is removed, and your sins are forgiven.' Then I heard the Lord asking, 'Whom should I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" Now, I'm betting many of you know that passage that I just read, and you know it right up to that point. And isn't that a wonderful conclusion to it? Who will go for me? Who will take a message to these people? Here I am, send me. And every time you read this and you cut it off there, it just sounds like Isaiah's just the most wonderful guy. Look at him, he stepped up to the plate to do this.
So the guy, jumping up and down,
Right.
Did he actually get picked to go?
Oh, he got picked all right. Because you see, if you keep reading, you remember what we said early on. I think Ben said it in the first class, and we've repeated it a couple of times. And that is, when you are elected, when you are called, you are not elected or called to stay where you are. You are elected or called to go. All right? So, 9 to 13, God says to Isaiah, after he says, "Here I am, send me," God says, "Go, say this, say to this people, listen, you listen, but you do not understand. You watch, but you learn nothing. I will harden the hearts of these people. I will plug their ears, I will shut their eyes." That that way. They will not see with their eyes, they will not hear with their ears, nor will they understand with their hearts, and they will turn to me for healing. Now, you've just volunteered because you've been overwhelmed by the glory of God, the kabod of God. You are just ready to go. And the message that you have to take is shut their eyes, shut their hearts, shut their ears, because maybe if that all happens, they'll turn to me for healing. And so Isaiah says to the Lord, Lord, how long will this go on? And God says, until their towns are empty, their houses are deserted, and the whole country is a wasteland. Until the Lord has sent everyone away and the entire land of Israel lies deserted. If even a tenth, a remnant, survive, they will be invaded again and burned. But as an oak tree leaves a stump when cut down, so Israel's stump will be a holy seed. In other words, go and tell them that you're going to have the same fate that the North had. You're going to be in exile. But out of you will come the holy seed. Isaiah goes into the temple because the earthly king is dead. He is overwhelmed by the glory, the kabod of God. Seraphim are everywhere. He perceives something new and he says, here I am. And the message that he has to take is not, you're such wonderful folks, I'm so glad you're here. The message that he has to take is, this is going to be a wasteland. Now, chapter 6 of Isaiah contains most of the major themes of the prophet Isaiah. And bear in mind, there's 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, so there is a lot to be said, okay? But in chapter 6, we see the sovereignty, the kingship of God. We see the sin of the people. We hear the destruction of the land. We see the glory of God, that is the temple. We see hope. Because Isaiah's prophecies are going to contain hope beyond the impending destruction. And we are told that a remnant will remain. Now, Isaiah was an urban man. He was from Jerusalem. He was at home in the royal court. And as I said a few minutes ago, he had a long prophetic career. But he was not always active in those 40 years. 742 to 735 is the first period of Isaiah's prophecies. And those are the ones that we can see in chapters 1 through 5 of the book of Isaiah. They are oracles. He sees Judah as a rebellious people. He sees them as a people with pride as their sin. He confronts Uzziah's successor, Ahaz. Ahaz would be co-regent with Jotham after the death of Uzziah for about 5 years, and then Ahaz would become king in 736. The reign of Ahaz was a disaster, politically and spiritually. And you can read all about it in 2 Chronicles 28 and 29. He was not Uzziah. He also would not listen to Isaiah. Ahaz started calling on Assyria for help, to be a benefactor. and he paid tribute to the Assyrians. And of course, this didn't make Isaiah happy in the least bit. That you can read in Isaiah chapter 7. But just to help you out with that, I'm going to read a little bit of this. When Ahaz, son of Jotham, grandson of Uzziah, was king of Judah, King Rezin of Syria, and Pekah was king in Israel, the Assyrians set out to attack Jerusalem. That news came to the royal court, and the hearts of the king and his people trembled with fear, like trees shaking in a storm. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Take your son, Shear-Jashub," whose name means a remnant will return. Nobody named their kids Michael, Jonathan, Benjamin, okay? Take your son, Shear-Jashub, and go out and meet King Ahaz. You'll find him at the end of the aqueduct that feeds water into the upper pool. Tell him to stop worrying. Tell him he does not need to fear the fierce anger of those two burnt-out embers, Reza of Syria and Pekah of Israel. Yes, the kings of Syria and Israel are plotting against him, saying, "We will attack Judah and capture it with the help of the Assyrians, and then we will install our own puppet." But this is what the sovereign Lord says. And when you read Isaiah, you will see that phrase over and over again. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Invasion will never happen, will never take place, for Syria is no stronger than its capital, Damascus, and Damascus no stronger than its king, Rezin. Israel is no stronger than its capital, Samaria, and Samaria is no stronger than its king, Pekah. Unless your faith is firm, I cannot make you stand firm. Later, the Lord sent this message to King Ahaz. Ask the Lord your God for a sign of confirmation, Ahaz. Make it as difficult as you want, as high as the heavens, as deep as the place of the dead. But the king refused. No, I won't test the Lord like that. And then Isaiah said, "Listen well, you royal family of David. Isn't it enough to exhaust human patience? Must you exhaust the patience of my God as well? All right then, the Lord himself will give you a sign." This part you've heard. "Look, a virgin will conceive a child and give birth to a son and call him Emmanuel," which means God with us. "By the time the child is old enough to choose what is right and reject what is wrong, it will be eating yogurt and honey. For before the child is that old, the lands of the two kings you fear so much will both be deserted." Now I know you all know that last passage. And as we have looked back over 2,000 years, we Christians, we have seen that as a prophecy of the coming of Jesus. But if we go back to the 8th century BC, we have to ask ourselves, is Isaiah talking about the Messiah to come, which indeed he just might be, or is he talking about life in the southern kingdom in the middle of the 8th century BC? Is God with us to judge us? If you lived in that day, you might ask yourself that. Or is God with us to save us? What is the sign that Isaiah points to? Is it the young woman? Is it the pregnancy? Is it the birth? Who is the young woman? And the last thing that one can ask oneself is the young child Hezekiah, who will be the son of Ahaz. Isaiah had it with Ahaz. And by about 732, 731, Isaiah withdrew. Stop prophesying. I've had it. So sorry I said, here am I, send me. What did I get myself into? What happened in 715 when he came back? That's when Hezekiah became the king. Hezekiah would reign from 715 to 686. And you can read about Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18 to 20. Isaiah talks about him in chapters 36 to 39, and in 2 Chronicles 29 to 32. Isaiah came back onto the scene at the coronation of Hezekiah. And this is what he wrote. The people who walked in darkness will see a great light. For those who live in the land of deep darkness, light will shine. You will enlarge the nation of Israel, and its people will rejoice. They will rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest, and like warriors dividing up the plunder. You will break the yoke of their slavery and lift the heavy burdens from their shoulders. You will break the oppressor's rod. You can probably all quote this with me. For to us a child is born, a son is given, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of his government and its peace, it will never end. He will rule with fairness and justice from the throne of his ancestor David for all eternity. The passionate commitment of the Lord of Heaven's armies will make this happen. Isaiah is incredibly optimistic at this point. And we just have to ask, is he optimistic for the Messiah whom we, 2,800 years later, know? Is he optimistic for Hezekiah? Is it both? Yes?
Would it be helpful to remember the covenant to David at this point?
Because, remember, we talked about this several weeks ago. In 2 Samuel 7, Nathan told David that the Lord would raise up from his line a Savior. That his line would reign.
His line would build him a house.
Would build him a house, and his line would reign.
And there's a duality to that, because David's literal son built the temple. But there is also that element of, but wait a minute, he didn't live forever.
Right. And not only did Solomon not live forever, but if you go through the whole lineage of the southern kingdom, which is where the Davidic line resided after the dividing of the kingdom, if you go through it, none of those kings lived forever. No matter how much they were loved. Uzziah had leprosy. Ahaz was a bust. So were many people before Uzziah. Hezekiah won't live forever.
But
So Isaiah is seeing something.
yeah, I think perhaps there's now a tradition, if you will, or a history of prophets saying a prophecy that has immediate implications and future outcomes that no one will live to see.
That no one will live to see. And you may remember, it was either last week or the week before, one of the things that I said was, you can't take the prophet out of the place and the setting in which he's living and in which he's speaking. Because prophets are grounded in the world where they are. They may have those dramatic moments in the temple where, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. They may have those great moments, but they're still grounded in the physical world in which they live, in which they are told by God, go and tell my people, etc., etc. Hezekiah, as a king, was viewed as a savior of his people. He came to the throne at a time when Judah was mired in political and spiritual depravity. The southern kingdom was not immune to the same kinds of spiritual depravity that we saw in the north. The big difference in the south, though, was they didn't have to go and create these golden idols to worship because they had the place of worship. But Ahaz allowed the temple to be defamed. And so Hezekiah, when he came to the throne, was dedicated to a complete reversal of his father's policies. He destroyed the numerous idols that were disgracing the temple. And not just the temple, but around the whole southern kingdom. He eliminated idolatry to a degree that was much greater than any of his pious ancestors who came before Ahaz, people like Jehoshaphat and Asa. Hezekiah also worked to reinstate pure worship of Yahweh. He restored the pilgrimages to the temple and is viewed as an important king of the southern kingdom. Interesting footnote is if you read the genealogy in Matthew's Gospel, which is chapter 1, and I urge you at some point to just read it. Perhaps as we get to the end of the semester where some of these names become more familiar, but read through it, and among the people that are identified as an ancestor of Jesus is Hezekiah, viewed as a great king, and Ahaz, viewed as a bust. Just another reminder of how God comes into this world through a variety of means and a variety of people. In 705, the king of the Assyrian Empire dies, and there is revolution in Assyria. Hezekiah saw this as an opportunity to end their subservience to the Assyrian kings, so he stopped paying tribute, the tribute that his father, Ahaz, had decided to pay. He also decided that he was going to enter into a league with Egypt. And he did this even though Isaiah told him not to. Isaiah 31. What sorrows await those who look to Egypt for help, trusting their horses, chariots, and charioteers, and depending on the strength of human armies, instead of looking to the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. In his wisdom, the Lord will send great disaster. He will not change his mind. He will rise up against the wicked and against their helpers. For these Egyptians are mere humans, not God. Their horses are puny flesh, not mighty spirits. When the Lord raises his fist against them, those who help will stumble, and those being helped will fall. They will all fall down and die together. But this is what the Lord has told me. When a strong young lion stands growling over sheep it has killed, it's not frightened by the shouts and noises of a whole crowd of shepherds. In the same way, the Lord of heaven's armies will come down and fight on Mount Zion. The Lord of heaven's armies will hover over Jerusalem and protect it like birds protecting their nest. He will defend and save the city. He will pass over it and rescue it. though you are such wicked rebels, my people, come and return to the Lord. I know a glorious day will come when each of you will throw away gold idols and silver images your sinful hands have made. Depending upon Egypt or any other little territory that was around them was not the solution. But like I said, Hezekiah just could not put his trust in the words of Isaiah. He expected the Egyptians to help, and guess what? They didn't. He then faced invasion by Sennacherib in the 4th year of his regime, which would be 701 BC. You can read all about that in 2 Kings 18. Isaiah believed that the invasion of Assyria in 701 was a sign of God's anger against Judah. He said, "This is what the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel says, only in returning to me and in resting in me will you be saved. In quietness and confidence is your strength, but you would have none of it." Assyrian historians tell us that Sennacherib lifted this siege of Jerusalem after Hezekiah changed his mind again, acknowledged Sennacherib as king and overlord, and agreed to pay tribute again. We're told in the Old Testament that Hezekiah tried to pay off Sennacherib with 300 talents of silver and 30 of gold. How did he get it? He looted the temple doors, the very temple that he had restored just a few years before. He now looted the doors to get the necessary money to pay tribute to Sennacherib. But that bought nothing, because after the payment, Sennacherib renewed his assault on Jerusalem. Judah is now weak. And Isaiah, the prophet, withdraws again. At this point, 700 BC, seemingly ending his career as a prophet. Not much more is known about his oracles, nor is much more written. In 687, 686, Hezekiah dies. He is succeeded by Manasseh, and Manasseh makes peace with Assyria. Again, reported in the second book of Kings, where the writer deplores the fact that Manasseh allowed the building of altars to pagan gods and the adopting of pagan cults, the persecution of the prophets, maybe one reason why we never hear from Isaiah again, that Manasseh allowed the reversal of some of the religious reforms that his father had instituted, and Manasseh restored polytheistic worship in the temple. Because of those things, Manasseh came to be viewed over the succeeding centuries as an arch enemy of the Davidic line, established when Nathan went to David. Your descendants will build me a house and will reign forever. And now we've got another rotten egg in the Davidic line. Indeed, in the book of Kings, 2 Kings, there are strong suggestions that Manasseh went so far as to execute those who supported his father. So, here we are, moving into the 7th century BC. The southern kingdom at this point has about 100 years. which all won't be good. And what I'm going to do, instead of starting Micah, I'm going to hold off and start Micah next week and take questions.
So, when we read in Isaiah 7 about, the virgin will do a child and do you have any more you could add to that? I mean, you kind of said we can take that two ways. Is this, so I'm curious, how would I mean, this is a question that no one in this room can probably answer, but I'm really curious as to how the king of Judah took those words. Like, how did they take those? Did they see that? Like you implied, did they see that as the coming of Hezekiah? Did they see that as the coming of the Messiah, or both?
I think, let me preface, it's really hard for any of us to move all the way back to the 8th century BC, but
Yeah.
I think that they would have seen this as the present time.
Yeah.
The fact that as a prophet, all of these prophets are speaking almost in a dual track. Here's today, and here's what I can see is coming.
Yeah.
Given the social and political, spiritual and political depravity in the southern kingdom, I don't think they were looking at anything that might be coming down the road. I think they were just looking at right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so they heard that, and that's why I raised the question, who is the young girl?
Right. Yeah. That's.
It could be the wife of Ahaz. It could be, some people have even suggested Isaiah's talking about his own wife. And Isaiah had 2 sons. The first one we introduced, and then he had a second son. I think Isaiah is talking about the child shall be called God with us. In his present world is definitely Hezekiah. But I think Isaiah knows that this Davidic line is going somewhere down the road.
But-
And go ahead.
But Jews also eventually
Took it to mean.
took it to mean something, that it was a prediction of a Messiah.
Okay.
They did come to see it that way. I mean,
And that was-
it's sort of an evolving understanding of Isaiah when Hezekiah's line just went, and then they were ended up sacked and hauled off into exile. They would look back on these prophecies and say,
Wow.
he must have been talking about something more than Hezekiah.
And I'm going to come to you in just a minute. Exile had an incredible power with not only the people of the northern kingdom, but also the southern kingdom.
Sure.
Being in exile had an incredible power to cause them to look back and go, oh, that's what he meant.
Okay. I see.
But at the present time, I don't think they're going that way yet. They would need the forced realization that all that stuff about, this country will come to an end, the land will be taken, only when that all happened. Oh my God, God's been saying that all along.
I see. So that makes sense.
So what would they have thought about the suffering servant? Like, what would that have, been to them?
I'm going to ask you to hold off on that, and the reason is that part of Isaiah comes much later and is written by somebody who very much admired Isaiah, okay, and was speaking in an Isaic mode, for lack of a better phrase. And I'm going to ask you to hold that because I am going to talk about that section of writing and the context in which it arose, and that will probably help us put that into a little more perspective. If I do it now, I'm sort of leaping about 100
Okay, I
years
just thought
ahead.
Isaiah was done, so.
Well, Isaiah as we know him, is done, but somebody's going to come back and want to sound very much like him and do a pretty good job of it. Okay?
Yeah, I mean, to that point, this is unique in the Bible, I think, where there are three sources, three histories, Isaiah, Kings, and Chronicles, and there are possibly 5 people at a minimum who are all offering their opinions and their take on what's going on here. So it is incredibly complicated, and rich, but.
And Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are not books of the Bible that appear in our lectionary. And, a little bit here, a little bit there, stuff, the Elijah stories. But those books are rich in telling the story of the divided kingdom, and some kings were good, some kings were bad, and they say that. And you remember a couple of weeks ago I said those books were probably written by people in the southern kingdom, and they don't waste any time telling you what was wrong with the northern kingdom. That they had those golden images, and they sinned, and yet Isaiah saying, hey guys, you're not so great either. And going back to where I was a minute ago, it's only when we've lost our homeland that all of a sudden,
Must have been something else.
And somehow also every good king in the South clears out all the high places and altars that are somehow in the South, even though, because they're there too. The things that Israel.
Yes, yeah.
All the things that they say, well, this is why Israel is, well, somehow they're still lurking there, and every good king that comes along.
Gets rid of them, and then they get a succession of bad kings who restore.
Yeah.
So it's part of understanding all of this. Helps you understand how they end up in exile. And then after exile, how they're able to look back on this and come to some of the realization of what's going on. Because after post-exilic time isn't going to be ideal for them either. And remember early on I said, David is held up as the model king who will rule like David. I mean, that phrase comes up over and over again. Somebody who will rule like David. And yet, what I'm trying to help you understand is they're all human. Every last one of them. But David somehow, probably because of the Davidic covenant, David was the one that even today, they keep going back to as the great king. Yeah, Janet.
Did any of the succeeding kings after the prophecy claim to be the Messiah? Or they just didn't,
I can't think of one.
Not until post-exile. And
Yeah,
would-be messiahs emerge post-exile.
But that's not only post-exile, that's post-Persian invasion.
Right.
I mean, that post-Persians, post-Alexander, that becomes much, much later when we start having people claiming to be messiahs. And there will be a lot of them, especially in the 1st century BC into the 1st century AD. There will be a lot of people who will be claiming to be messiah. I mean, at one level, it's almost kind of like those those people in New York with the sandwich boards back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, they were all over the place, and they were all busy saying, the world's coming to an end, or this is a judgment, or whatever. That's Messiah on every block.
And that and apocalypticism are coterminous. They happen at the same time. The apocalyptic vision where this is going to be completely turned upside down, wiped out, obliterated. When all hope for the hereditary kingship has been abandoned, then it's the new.
And that will come in, you'll get a taste of that in the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a post-exilic book, which takes on a whole nother tact from where we are.
In which at least one scholar, who I happen to be very fond of, thinks that Jesus very much modeled. He did not model his ministry after one prophet, but Daniel was definitely one of them.
Yeah.
Was there continuity between the prophets? I mean, were they aware of the other prophets that, like, put by verbally written, or were they working on their own God level?
I am not aware. No, you know what? Let me back up. I'm not aware in the north that there was much contact, if any, between Amos and Hosea, who were the two great 8th century BC prophets. In the south, and I will point this out to you next week, there is a passage in Isaiah and a passage in Micah that are virtually identical. And Micah comes after Isaiah. So it suggests that Micah knew something of Isaiah's work. But I'll show you that passage next week. Okay, thank you all.